Okay, so on February 24th, 1986, Sherry Rasmussen was debating whether or not she was going to go to work. She had an unexciting class on her schedule, and so she decided to call out sick using a recent back injury as an excuse. Now, John, who was her husband, left for work soon after. Okay, so now it's a few hours later, and John calls the house. Now, when his call goes unanswered, he tried Sherry's work, assuming she, decided to go in. But he couldn't reach her there either. So he called the house a few more times, but to no avail. Now, John, of course, he's in his head at this point, and he's trying to ignore his worries and, just continue on with his day. But when he got home from work, he found a nightmarish scene. He found the answering machine unactivated, even though they activated it every day. He found a bloody handprint next to the panic button near the alarm, and the room was covered in nothing but broken objects. John Ruetten, which was his full name, then found Sherry Rasmussen dead in the living room. She had been shot 3 times. And now, an LAPD forensic specialist also found a bite mark on her arm, and he took a swab of it. Now, the LAPD quickly ruled Sherry Rasmussen was a victim of a burglary. Though neighbors heard screaming and fighting, they did not call the police. Police surmised that the burglar was in the process of carrying, all the electronics out when Rasmussen came upon them, and then the fight ensued. And then the police recovered Rasmussen's missing car. And the only other stolen item was the couple's marriage license. Now, John was ruled out as a suspect, and then he moved from Los Angeles after the murder. And Sherry's father mentioned his daughter's issues with a woman named Stephanie Lazarus to the police. And, a little note was made. But the lead was never really followed up on. And this is probably because Stephanie Lazarus was also a police officer. And though the bite mark proved to be unusual, the case went cold as no suspect was ever identified. And the case just continued to be cold for 23 years. I mean, is there any hope in solving this? Well, this time, yes. Yes, there is. You see, at the time, the LAPD was too overwhelmed with the growing crack epidemic and related gang violence to dedicate the time that it needed for the investigation. But Sherry's father never believed that his daughter would not have been able to defend herself against some random burglar. And Sherry's father also tried for several years to have this case reopened. And later, detectives refused to do it, and it was not until DNA testing became available that the case gained a little bit of new traction. Now, a dedicated team at the LAPD worked out old forensic cases using new technology, and Sherry Rasmussen's case was now eligible. So, in 2004, criminalist Jennifer Francis found missing evidence from the file and the cotton swab with the DNA on it. Now, the saliva bite mark were deemed to be female, proving the initial theory of a male burglar was not possible. But for some reason, no detective wanted to take this case. For some reason, so it just remained cold again. Then, fast forwarding to 2009, the LAPD finally reopened the case, and it was ruled a murder, with the burglary staged to throw police off the trail. Now, detectives were looking back at the case, and they eventually found Stephanie Lazarus's name in the notes from the original investigation, and they decided finally to pursue this lead. Now, they collected DNA from a coffee cup of Lazarus's that she threw away while off duty, and they were able to match it to the sample taken from the bite mark. Pretty cool stuff. Now, this evidence would prove that Stephanie Lazarus was Sherry Rasmussen's killer, and she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life at the California Institution for Women. Now, she has attempted to appeal her case several times, but the lower courts have upheld the conviction every time. Furthermore, the initial investigation of Rasmussen's death is now believed to have been purposely botched by the LAPD to protect Lazarus, one of their own. So, let's look at it this way. Sherry Rasmussen was found shot to death inside her home on February 24th, 1986 in an apparent burglary gone wrong. But the real killer was Stephanie Lazarus. And while you may be asking yourself is, why? Now this is the twisted story behind the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. You see, Stephanie Lazarus wasn't somebody that just came in out of the blue. She was somebody that actually had an in-depth relationship with John. Yes, John Rutten and Stephanie Lazarus were both students at the University of California, Los Angeles, when they met and were both set to graduate in 1982. Now, John was a mechanical engineering major, and Lazarus was studying political science. They were also both active and very athletic. So John and Stephanie Lazarus began a casual relationship, but were not intimate with each other until after graduation. Now, John took a job as a hardware developer, and Lazarus became a police officer at the LAPD. Now, though they hooked up a number of times, they never made their relationship official. It was never concrete. And later, John met Sherry Rasmussen, who was quickly rising within the medical field. And she was already the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. So Sherry and John bonded quickly, and soon they even moved into their own apartment together in Van Nuys. And Stephanie Lazarus, meanwhile, had a hard time just letting go of John and made herself something of a third wheel in their relationship, a situation that really made Sherry often uncomfortable. Now, at the 25th birthday party that Lazarus threw for John, he told her about Sherry, confessing that they were seriously involved. And let's just say Lazarus, she wasn't really happy, and she actually wrote a letter to John's mother in 1985. And the letter said this:
I'm truly in love with John, and the past year has really torn me up. I wish it didn't have to end the way it did, and I don't think I'll ever understand his decision.
John later testified that before he and Rasmussen got married, he and Lazarus had sex one final time so, Lazarus could have some closure on the relationship. But instead, Stephanie Lazarus began hanging around more and more. And her constant contact with John worried Sherry. But John, assured her, babe, everything's going to be okay. It's nothing more than a friendship between us right now. However, Lazarus, her infatuation just grew stronger and stronger. And at one point, she even came to Sherry's office to tell her, if I can't have John, no one else will. And I mean, who are you really going to tell at this point? You can tell family and stuff, but are you going to call the police and say, hey, a police officer just basically told me in a, passive-aggressive way that she's going to kill me? I mean, Sherry definitely was put in a very tough spot. I could only imagine how uncomfortable that made her feel hearing that, and just the clock ticking in her head, what to do about, should I tell somebody? What should I do? Should I call the police? Or if I do call the police, maybe it's one of her friends and maybe they won't take me seriously, or maybe they'll tell Lazarus and that'll piss her off more and then she'll come after me sooner. Just imagine the thoughts that could have been rushing through her head. And even though Sherry was worried that Lazarus was stalking her, You know, Sherry leaned into John's assurances, and the pair got married in November of 1985. And they had 3 months of marital bliss before tragedy struck. And the rest, you already know. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard this person's name, but many of you might not have known much more than that. But no worries, that's why I'm here. So today, our story is on the notorious Jimmy Hoffa. As of today, there is only one FBI agent in Detroit that is signed to the disappearing case of Jimmy Hoffa. But back in the days when he disappeared, there were actually more than 200 agents at the same time that were working on the case. And they tried to look at every skeleton in his closet. They interviewed his friends, his family, his associates. They collected evidence trying to connect the dots. But regardless, no one found out what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa, especially who kidnapped him and where his body was taken. So for generations, his disappearance has baffled many. Now, Jimmy Hoffa was a union leader and was almost seen as a god and a hero by many working Americans. Even during his 20s, he became a significant figure in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and working on growth and development of the union. And it soon became the largest union by membership in America, counting more than 1.5 million members while he was leader. Now, although he did have the working class on his side, the mafia was definitely not on his friends list. Jimmy was involved in criminal activity since he became a leader of the union and made many enemies throughout the years, and some believe that the mafia itself was responsible for his disappearance. Now, Jimmy was almost immune to persecution during the 50s, but President John F. Kennedy's brother Bobby dedicated several years of his career trying to pin him down. And in the 60s, Bobby Kennedy was on the Senate Select Committee of Improper Activities in the labor and management field as a chief counsel. And then later, he became the Attorney General and grilled Jimmy in the courtroom. Then 2 years later, in 1962, Kennedy finally had a case against Hoffa, and it was extortion of illegal payments, but the case proceedings resulted in a hung jury where the jury was split. However, Jimmy was arrested later for bribing one of the jury members, so he was in fact sentenced to 8 years in prison. Then in 1964, he was found guilty of embezzling $1.7 million from the Union Pensions Fund. And at that time, a lot of his connections helped him stay out of jail until 1967, when he ended up serving 58 months. Now, the rest of his sentence was abolished by President Nixon with one condition in mind, which was that Jimmy had to stay out of the union and politics until the 80s, when his sentence would have ended, and Jimmy agreed. So you could say that this condition was really not taken seriously by Jimmy at all, because he continued to chase his goals and tried to regain his authority in the union politics. And there was a man named Frank Fitzsimmons who at once was his right-hand man, but when he went in prison, he became in the leadership position. And the mob itself did not like Jimmy's maneuvers to take back his former position and warned him several times explicitly, but Jimmy was known to be a very stubborn man. So while Fitzsimmons was easy to manipulate and easy to force to look the other way, Jimmy kind of regained control, and this would be bad for him. Now, fast forwarding to July 30th in 1975, this was the infamous day when Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. So Jimmy received a call that day to meet an important local mobster who was a Detroit labor boss and a powerful person in the Teamsters politics. They were supposed to meet outside Detroit at the Red Fox restaurant, so Jimmy Hoffa arrived first, sat at a table, looked at the menu, and waited. Now, just about a half an hour passed by, and Jimmy at this point was, probably a little suspicious about what's going on because nobody came in, so Jimmy found a payphone and called his wife, and he told her that no one had appeared yet. And then he also told her that he was just going to wait a few more minutes and then he would come home. So he waited a few more minutes, left the restaurant, and then just like that, was never seen again. Now, there were witnesses who saw him walking to his car with 3 or 4 other men that were inside, and according to the investigation, he did not leave that car alive. The FBI thought that 2 of the men Jimmy was supposed to meet at the restaurant were Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano. Now, some say that the meeting could have been a peace offering, but when Hoffa didn't agree to their demands, they may have, without warning, executed him. Now, Tony had an alibi, and it was a convenient little story that he was showing around Neboken to Union officials the day that Hoffa disappeared. Plus, let's be honest, with the amount of people that Jimmy ticked off, the list of suspects was very, very long. And the FBI didn't have a real lead or break in the case because everybody wanted to stay away from it. And at this point, evidence was also limited. And after several months, they were able to track down the car Jimmy was taken with, where they found his hair and blood inside. Now, to be clear, in the car, there was absolutely no sign of his body, and absolutely nobody wanted to discuss it. They even had to hypnotize the witnesses and informants in order to find out the truth, which is crazy and amazing at the same time that they were this loyal or scared of this man. And to be honest, nothing really uncovered the truth about the kidnapping. So the FBI was left like us, just with a bunch of theories. I mean, there were even many convicts who had contacted the police with hints, clues, and theories, and in one instance, Ralph Picardo claimed that Hoffa was put in a 55-gallon drum made of steel, loaded onto a truck. He said he didn't know where they took him or anything like that, but rumor had it that he was buried on the grounds of a toxic waste location near the Brothers Moscato junkyard. And then, according to another theory, Jimmy Hoffa's body lies underneath the New York Giants football stadium in East Rutherford. And his body was apparently mixed in with the concrete at the construction of the stadium. And other burial grounds were also suggested, such as the helideck of the Sheraton Savannah Resort Hotel, and also a public garage that resided in Cadillac, Michigan. Now, that's a lot of theories of where one person could be buried. Now, there is another theory that was received in 2006, when Richard Kuklinski claimed that he killed Hoffa himself with a knife and buried his body in a drum in a junkyard. And according to his confession, the drum was actually dug out by police, and it was near a manufacturing vehicles part where they placed scrap metal, but once again, Jimmy was not found. And a lot of false information led the police to countless digs, but none of them revealed the body of Jimmy Hoffa. So some say he wasn't even murdered, and he fled to Brazil to start a new life. And the case file, containing now more than 16,000 pages, is still open, and new leads are welcome, even though Hoffa was declared legally dead in 1982. Now, like I said at the beginning, this is a person that at one time we've all probably heard their name, but we didn't know much about. So I hope that at least through this, even though you may have known this person, you got a little more context and found out a little more about this situation. And I'm going to say that if I was a betting man, I would say the mob did kill him. And they wanted to make a statement when killing him. So to be honest, the 55-gallon drum made of steel loaded onto a truck makes a lot of sense. And even the New York Giants football stadium concrete theory makes a lot of sense. But to be honest, he could have just been drove to the Hudson River, shot in the head, and then dropped in. We'll never know until we do. At least that's my theory. Now, what's yours? Be sure to let me know in the comment section, because I read every comment, and I'm actually very interested to know what you think happened to this very well-known man. Now, in Sycamore, Illinois, there was a 7-year-old Maria who was a very pretty young girl. And she had these big brown eyes, and she shined with warmth and intelligence. And Kathy, who was a year older, felt honored to be her friend. Now, they only lived a few doors down from each other on a side street called Archie's Place, or Archie Place. Now, it was their whole world back in 1957, a time when children played hide and seek outside instead of, watching television or being on their phones, and people didn't lock their doors in this Midwestern farm town because, everybody knew everybody else. Okay, so on the first Tuesday of December in 1957, the two girls later in the day were outside, and all of a sudden, a older male who called himself Johnny asked if, they both wanted some piggyback rides. Now, of course, these little kids, they both said yes, and Maria went first. And Johnny asked if they also liked dolls. And, of course, they said yes. So Maria, she ran to her house 3 doors down at 616 Archie Place to fetch a beloved doll of hers and to get the next piggyback ride. But Kathy waited on the sidewalk with Johnny, and he asked whether she wanted to take a walk around the block or go on a trip in his truck or car or bus. And she said, no, thank you. Now, he told her she was pretty, but she sensed it was Maria, actually, that he liked more. So now you got Maria, and she's running down the street, and then she bursts into her house, only to find her father, Michael, in the living room watching a old Western movie. And her mother, Frances, was reading the newspaper. So Maria kind of looked through and she picked out her favorite doll from the toys piled that were right around the door. But her mother suggested that she take an older rubber doll out into the snow instead so it doesn't get ruined. Now, Kathy felt a chill, I would describe it as soon as Maria joined them back on the sidewalk, because now, it was Kathy's turn to run home because she had to go get her mittens. And she asked Maria to come along, but Maria didn't want to go. And then, when Kathy returned just a few minutes later with her gloves, Maria and Johnny were gone. And sadly, this was the last time Maria Ridolph was ever seen alive. Now, the search for Maria and her kidnapper turned into an FBI investigation. Now, an early suspect was John Tessier, the son of a neighbor who the community only described as creepy. Now, Maria's kidnapping made national headlines. Many people were interested in finding this little girl, including the President of the United States at that time, Dwight Eisenhower. Now, according to some sources, both he and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, asked to be updated regularly on the case because they wanted to know everything. And there was a lot resting on finding her, preferably alive. Unfortunately, Maria's body was found 5 months later and 90 miles away. Now, however, John had an alibi, and he passed a lie detector test. And his alibi was that he was joining the army and he had a train ticket, so there was no possible way he could have done it. No possible way. Or could he? Now, nothing really came of this, and the case kind of went cold. So an unexpected lead came in 1994 when John Tessier's mother, Eileen, made a dying confession to her daughter, Janet. And she said, quote,
"Those 2 little girls and the one that disappeared, honey, John did it. John did it. And you have to tell someone."
I know, kind of crazy, right? I mean, deathbed confession. And not only this, but after a number of years, police found a photograph of John with his ticket. And the ticket was never stamped, which means he never went on that train. Then, all the way in 2008, headlines were made again when a breakthrough occurred in the Maria Ridolph cold case. Now, Jake McAuliffe, then known as John Tessier, was brought in. And the murder of Maria Rudolph was believed to be solved in 2012 when he was convicted of the crime. And this conviction mainly came because Kathy and her testimony of remembering Johnny, who was John Tessier, and later changed his name to Jack McAuliffe. Plus, Jack also had a couple of run-ins of the law, being accused a couple times of sexual assault, and it seemed like this case would finally just be closed, and the oldest cold case ever of 50 plus years would be finally put to rest. The intel and the information were finally coming to a close. Well, that's the story that would have been told to you, like I said, up until about 7 or 8 years ago. Because the twists keep coming. In the decades-old tragedy, as it turns out, McAuliffe was wrongly imprisoned for a crime that he did not commit. And McAuliffe got out of prison in 2016, and the charges against him were dropped. And with Jack McAuliffe innocent, Maria Rudolph's case is once again open, and her murder remains unsolved. Now, maybe they really did get it wrong, and John was not the killer. But 11 days after Maria went missing, he did join the military, moved to Washington State, and became a policeman in Lacey, which is a town east of Olympia. So at the end of the day, why things were overturned in court and why he is innocent is because the evidence didn't line up. And that photograph that was shown to Kathy, as we talked about earlier, how Kathy was an important part, that's because she saw a photograph and said, yep, that's Johnny, that's who I saw. Well, that photograph that was shown to Kathy that pinned John as the suspect was quote-unquote suggestive in the extreme. Now, this means most likely she was given information prior that, hey, that's the person of interest. Make sure to pick him. So now, because of the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine and many other doctrines, this would, as you know, be void, nullified in court, not admissible, whatever you want to say. So the legal system, basically, if Johnny is the killer, which, you know, I mean, Johnny, no stamp ticket, alibi falls apart. I mean, if he really is the killer, this was a serious miscarriage of justice, because he still belongs in prison for what probably he did, which is probably killing Maria. I mean, we know she was found 90 miles away. And, you know, a case like this is just so sad, because such a little girl who has her whole life ahead of her, you would think the least we could do for her is find her damn killer.